Welcome back, everyone. Our third session today, New Directions in Foreign Trade, comprises of two events. The first is a conversation between Ambassador Jayant Dasgupta, member, Governing Council, Research and Information Systems for Developing Countries, RIS, and Dr. Harshvardhan Singh, former Deputy Director General, WTO. Welcome, gentlemen, to AED 2022. The floor is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shilpa, and greetings to you, Ambassador Dasgupta. When one thinks about the developments at the WTO, especially the last few years have been particularly difficult for the system, both in terms of certain established systems being being changed or being situations created so that they are not operational. There are large number of issues on which different members of the WTO have very different positions, and this is also to some extent led to unraveling of some agreed systems and processes and even some agreements within the WTO. And there appears to be difficulty in carrying out engaged dialogue to reach conclusions which are consensus-based, whether in terms of soft law or hard law. So the first thought which I would request you to focus on is how to carry on this kind of a dialogue so that we become more constructive and achieve some actual conclusions. And how can members harvest some results through a consensus-based mechanism? To the extent, is it possible? If so, what should be done?
Thank you, Harsha. That's a very interesting question that you have raised. Indeed, I think after the Bali Ministerial Conference and the harvesting of the trade facilitation agreement, along with the agreement on public stockholding for food security purposes, I think the negotiating function of the WTO has been relatively slow in moving along. One of the reasons why I think, and it's a personal opinion, why this has happened is I think we have not really learned a lesson from the experiences of the past. And the immediate past experience is that of the trade facilitation agreement, which I think was hailed by member countries across the board, whether they were developed countries or in the middle or developing countries or LDCs, primarily because of two reasons. One, that it allowed for the required flexibility, and it acknowledged that there would be differences in the levels of development, in the governance structures, and so many countries would require time to catch up. The second aspect was many of the countries would not have the financial wherewithal to bring in changes or to implement them within the time frame allowed. Or so the time frame was made flexible, and there was this promise of assistance that once technical assistance flowed and they found themselves capable, they could take commitments. So I think this was a way of addressing the issue which has come about in the WTO after the GATT days, when dispute settlement action used to be a one-stage process, and two, the process was not as hard on the members, especially the ones who lost a case, as it is now. So I think this was a very good way of adjusting to the new setting, because the whole membership wants a two-stage process. There is no going back to the old GATT days in terms of dispute settlement, but of giving that flexibility to the developing countries and LDCs who are not in a position to take on commitments, to phase in their commitments, and then there could be some kind of technical assistance promise. Now, this is a lesson. Of course, it has its own limitations in terms of replicability in other agreements. But I think one of the things which took place around 2017 was the joint statement initiatives of various groups of countries, very large groups of countries, numbering, I think, on an average about 70, 80. In one case, it was about 120 odd. So in these cases, it was fraught with problems because it was not very clear whether they were part of the WTO negotiations or they were outside the WTO negotiations. Secondly, if there were to be a consensus amongst the smaller groups or these joint statement initiative countries, what would be the process of multilateralizing these decisions? So I think a schism was there, which was unwittingly brought about by putting these JSI, joint statement initiative subject matters on a different footing from, let's say, the normal plurilateral kind of functioning, because we have had, even in the recent past, the ITA 2 agreement, the Information Technology 2 agreement, which was a plurilateral agreement following on the steps of the ITA 1 of 1997. But these joint statement initiatives, I think, left that vacuum, that space unoccupied, and that created doubts in the minds of the membership, especially the poorer ones. Yes.
Can I just come in here? Because perhaps what you are talking about is the members can negotiate an agreement, but if they provide the benefits on an MFN basis, and the members of any agreement, a plurilateral one, actually are the ones who take the burdens of additional disciplines, that, according to you, is something which can work in this situation? Is that what you're really indicating?
Yes, that you have, I think, articulated it very well. What I wanted to drive home is the point that there has to be a meeting of minds, and that must include the whole of the membership. And there would be certain countries which would not be in a position to take on most of the commitments at one go or right at the beginning. So if this kind of comfort were to be provided, and for legitimate reasons, because even in the GATT days, there was this practice of moral suasion, of peer reviews, etc. Now, that has unfortunately fallen by the wayside. So that is the kind of thing which could be revived. And countries which are not in a position to take the whole of the commitments at one go could be given some kind of flexibility within a time frame. And of course, with the promise of technical assistance, etc., for the very poor countries, the LDCs. So this could solve the problem to a great extent. Now, obviously, if it is, yes, please.
Yeah, sorry. So, the model you have given is of an agreement which is a multilateral agreement. While the kind of initiatives which you say are causing a problem are, one of the examples you mentioned is plurilateral ones. So are you saying something like the flexibility provided, or the kind of concept which was there in the reference paper on telecom, where countries had options to accept some but not all of the disciplines? And perhaps if we combine it with incremental time bound, because that's the kind of model you have in trade facilitation, time bound agreement that after X years, this category of country will agree to the XYZ. So is that the kind of model you have in mind for a solution?
Yes. I more or less what you have said. The telecom reference paper, I think, is a very good case in point, because there was no compulsion, and at the same time, you could join it, you could take on the obligations in a phased manner. In the case of the government procurement agreement also, the option was left entirely open to the countries to either join or remain as observers, join as observers. And of course, there were certain obligations to be assumed once you joined later, because the other members could ask you for certain concessions if you were not one of the original members. So that, I think, is par for the course. That could be one of the ways of sorting out this impasse in a way, and also providing energy to the negotiating process, because this, along with the dispute settlement process, are the two jewels, the twin jewels, I would say, of this new WTO. And if the negotiating function goes into limbo, then I think there is very little left for the members to look forward to in terms of benefits, especially for the developing countries, to look forward to, and for their greater participation in global trade, which is there in the preamble of the WTO agreement as well.
Okay. So one last question in the negotiating context, and then I want to just move to some other context, which is that one of the concerns in the context of plurilaterals and the importance of most favored nation treatment is this worry about free riders, that if there is a very substantive economy which is not part of the agreement but gets all the benefits, then to that extent there is disincentive to really have an agreement. But the evidence of these plurilaterals which are carrying on suggests that the countries which are outside, to the extent the negotiations are going on, they are, even if they are normally perceived as free riders and therefore create problems, actually are not really free riders as such for the negotiating purposes. So is it that the problem of free riders is not really a valid issue to think about in the context in which the current negotiations are going on?
I think if there are very large countries which have a very substantial share of global trade in a particular area, and they are not participating in negotiations in that area, there could be a problem of free riders. But if you find, if you look at the joint statement initiatives, you'll find that, for instance, a very large developing country like China has played an active role in joining many of the JSIs. So I think the issue of free riders is perhaps perceived to be more of a problem than it actually is. Okay. It is not really as much of a problem.
Okay. Now I just want to shift to the area of regulatory cooperation. So that might be something easier to achieve within the context of WTO, especially in technical barriers to trade or other areas where standards become relevant or regulations become relevant. Is that something which faces similar kind of concerns, or is that an easier area to handle? And if so, how should the members go about it?
Regulatory coherence, in a sense, if I could put it under this label, is I think it is something which could be harvested, provided there is no rigidity in the stance of those who are propounding a particular line or a particular proposal, and they have this in their minds that our system is the best system in the world and everybody else has to fall in line. And this is something which we encountered in the case of the trade facilitation agreement also, because there were major countries which thought that their systems were the best in the world. And when flaws were pointed out, when other counter proposals came up, at one point of time, there were about 2,700 square brackets in the negotiating text of the trade facilitation agreement. So there was this give and take. There was this attitude that, all right, what we find to be good for ourselves may not be up to your choice, but we are prepared to make a compromise, provided it does not act as a barrier to trade, and it is actually a liberalizing measure. So I think to that extent, attitudes will have to be softened rather than stiffened in the negotiations.
That's a combination of two very interesting points you just said. That does not act as a barrier to trade, and the second point you said is liberalizing. So by even in a liberalizing context, you can have mechanisms which prove to be barriers through other methods. So to the extent there are these checks and balances which you can put in place, the point you are making is there's no single model to necessarily emphasize as part of the solution. Rather, there is a single or maybe just a few principles to emphasize. So am I correct in reading you there?
Yes, I would agree with you that there are a few principles which need to be borne in mind when embarking on any negotiation. And the ultimate objective of any negotiation in the WTO is to liberalize trade, is to make it easier for countries to participate and to gain from the benefits of a larger cake or pie, if we may put it that way. So, as you mentioned, TBT, for instance, SPS measures in some cases, they are often used as non-tariff barriers, particularly TBT. And because there is not very significant harmonization of standards, especially if you look at many of the standards across the Atlantic, on the two sides of the Atlantic, there is a lack of harmonization even amongst these two very major trading partners. So there is a requirement for having regulatory coherence, for having standards harmonized, which will, and for procedures also to be harmonized, which has been, I think, achieved a great deal in terms of the trade facilitation agreement, but a lot of work still needs to be done in that direction.
So you are using two different terms, coherence and harmonized. If I want to distinguish between them, then harmonized would be more along the lines of similar or same. I'm just trying to distinguish the two. And coherence is more, the objective is not inconsistent with the other. So would I be correct to say that to the extent something can be harmonized, go ahead with it. But if there are differences in procedures, history, capabilities, etc., then aim for coherence. And that itself requires support and time and transition and support of multiple types. So am I correct in reading what you're suggesting?
What I had in mind, of course, I was not really being very strict about using the expressions, but in terms of harmonizing of standards, we have something concrete in front of us. For instance, a light bulb, it should operate at, if it operates at 220 volts, it should give this much of light. That is far easier to harmonize than, let's say, the procedures dealing with how to go about various things in which exporters and importers come up against. So regulatory coherence, I think, is far more broad-based. It is multifaceted and would be much more difficult to achieve in all respects than harmonization of standards. So I think harmonization of standards is the first step which should take place, and then the procedures related to the harmonization of standards, etc., if they were standardized and they were there was regulatory coherence in those matters, then that would help, and ultimately we would be able to move quite a bit down that path.
So you had earlier talked about the importance of the principle or objective you're focusing on in any discussion or negotiation. And whenever any negotiation begins, there might be a primary emphasis, say COVID, etc., addressing access to vaccines, medicines, etc. And then members may come with various other links in the conceptual chain. If you deal with the entire package together, it delays the primary objective, so to say. Any ideas on how to deal with this so that at least the primary focus remains a priority? And maybe in some sense, you then see which of the associated demands are actually necessary for meeting the primary focus. Is there some way one can actually identify and prioritize, or the negotiations have to go through the entire gamut of issues which arise?
Well, in this case, I would nuance this whole issue in the sense that the original proponents of a proposal may have a very narrow kind of an objective in mind, with, let's say, a few deliverables or outcomes which they have in mind. But when it is thrown open to the rest of the membership, they may have different perspectives, different expectations to reap out of a particular agreement. So they would also put in their proposals. Some of them may be counter proposals, some of them may be parallel proposals or independent proposals. So I think if we have to proceed, we can't remain stuck to the original proposal only. We have to bring in other streams and rivers which are meeting the broader, larger river, as we say in India. And then we have to try to harmonize and then see what is it that we are driving at. After all the proposals, that is exactly what happened in the trade facilitation agreement also. Once we had all kinds of proposals placed on the table, and then we started looking at them closely, we found that there was a common link, a common strand running through most of them. And it was about opening up markets, it was about liberalization, reducing uncertainty, and providing more transparency.
Okay, that's, in fact, you've very well summarized the thought of what I meant by prioritization. What is it that you're really driving at?
Yes.
So once you try and focus on that, maybe you can distinguish between the different efforts and focus on what you are really driving at and achieving that. And the other aspects become facilitative or supportive, but not the main issue on which priority attention should be given. That's the kind of thought which I had in mind. We are almost at the end, so I'll very quickly ask you, there are two big issues. You can just give your initial comments, and then the ambassador's session can take that up further if any of them wishes, or each of them wishes. One is the dispute settlement system, the problem there. And second is the issue or concern of the WTO system meeting or creating disciplines to address some of the policies which otherwise have not been characterized by transparency or by more associated with non-market economies, etc. So to that extent, some very quick thoughts on that might be an entry point into the discussion later, if it does take place.
On the first issue of the dispute settlement system, I think work has been progressing on that since 1998, of course, in fits and starts. But I think on many of the major issues, there is increasing convergence in a sense. So the two-stage process is there. There aren't any naysayers on that. The second issue is about not creating new law. That will have to be gone into in some detail amongst members, because many of them follow the British system of jurisprudence, and there is always an appellate mechanism, and if there is kind of a gap, the appellate body, it fills in the legislative gap. So whether if that is not acceptable to the larger membership, I think that should be given the go by. The final issue is about the appellate body, about which I think the European Union had given a proposal some time ago, that it should be a permanent body in the sense that the members would be, as it is now, they would be taken from a broader membership, broader kind of a base, if I may say. And the dispute settlement panels would have a permanent membership. Now, that is something which is, I think, which is a divisive kind of an issue at the moment, but a lot of negotiating effort will have to be invested in that if that is what the EU wants. So let us try it out. On the second point, which you mentioned, the second issue, I think there has to be some, subsidies, and I am talking about the elephant in the room. In the case of subsidies, the maximum amount of lack of transparency is normally found in the case of subsidies. So there would have to be, I think, new methods and new disciplines, and that has also been tabled by one or the other of the countries, so that people or countries do not take advantage of lacunae in the system, game the system and to gain unfair advantage, and to push their exports in the global market. So I think that is quite, because once we, let's say, devise a set of rules, and then we find that there are some gaps which have been left, and people are taking advantage of that. We need to plug those gaps. So that is a continuous process, an iterative process, and we must do that.
Good, good. So you've shared a lot of thoughts very quickly. We have just about 2-3 minutes. The pandemic issue, we are finding it difficult getting a multilateral solution as such. Is there a possibility in the Asian context to come out with something which might be also lead to a path which can be accepted by larger number of countries in some sense? Or that's not possible given the nature of the beast, so to say?
I think it would be slightly difficult because if you look at the Asian countries, apart from Japan, no other country, and China, of course, no other country has brought out a vaccine, for instance. The field of medicines, therapeutics, also, there is, I think, less representation from Asia than from Europe and the US and Canada. So I think it would be difficult for the Asian countries to get together and come out with some kind of an example-setting, exercise, and which would provide some, impetus to the rest of the world to follow.
But to the extent certain things could be done, are there some which could be worked upon in cooperation, collaboration, etc.?
Yes, indeed. I think, and India, South Africa, and the other countries which have tabled this paper, I think this points to various areas of cooperation. And one of them, of course, this has also been tabled as one of the 2 papers before the ministerial MC12. That is that unnecessary export restrictions will not be placed. Because even in the case of India, we are making 3 kinds of vaccines, at least 4, in fact, now. And for cell culture media, we need certain ingredients which are mainly from Europe or the US. So there are various kinds of things. There are approximately 9,000 things which a vaccine manufacturing company requires. And it comes from 300 sources. That is what has been calculated, and many countries are suppliers of that. So export restrictions at any stage can upset this whole supply chain.
In the supply chain context.
Yes, and have very adverse consequences for humanity at large.
Yeah. So you made a very important point that the solution involves all countries concerned, not just few or not just a region. And the efforts need to be made by all of them concerned. So I think this brings us to the end of the session. It was very enjoyable listening to you. Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure, great pleasure.
Thank you. Likewise. I revert back to the anchor to prepare for the next session.
Thank you very much, Dr. Singh. Many thanks, Ambassador Dasgupta. Moving on to the next segment under session 3, a discussion on WTO challenges and opportunities. Session Chair, Dr. Harshvardhan Singh, former DDG WTO, will engage with Her Excellency Ambassador Xolelwa Mlumbi-Peter from South Africa, His Excellency Ambassador George Mina, Australia, His Excellency Ambassador Brajendra Navnit, India, and His Excellency Dr. Anup Wadhawan, former Commerce Secretary, Government of India. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, and welcome to the ambassadors and former Commerce Secretary, Mr. Wadhawan. I will actually, most of the talking will be done by all of you. I'm requesting Dr. Dasgupta to stay on. He will come in only for a few minutes later. So initially, each of you will have 10 minutes to speak. And in that context, once you've finished with your 10 minutes each, the 4 of you, we'll begin with some discussion or comments, further comments on each other. And there I will invite Ambassador Dasgupta first for about 3-4 minutes, and then a similar kind of intervention by each of you. We can have a discussion also during that time. To the extent some time is available at the end, we will take some questions from the audience. So I first request the Ambassador of South Africa. I request the floor to be given to her so that you can talk about various issues. The issues which I will just refer to for reference rather than for guidance, which are seen as challenges. Some of them you have already heard from Ambassador Dasgupta. So an important one is WTO response to the pandemic, how the conditions about TRIPS, other issues, fisheries subsidies agreement, permanent solution for public stockholding program for food security, WTO reform, you have the dispute settlement body, the appellate body, you have special and differential treatment issues. So these are all issues on which there are 2 different views amongst the members, but they need to be addressed, like agriculture support, various aspects of the agriculture agreement, perceived imbalances in the extent of flexibility, which were negotiated earlier, new large subsidizers, possibility of introducing product-specific support. So some kind of solution which might come in certain parts of them also. Then subsidy disciplines, we have already talked about that in the context of concerns about non-market economy, etc. Plurilateral versus multilateral agreements. There was another thought of progressing on rulemaking in creative ways. So what are some of the ways in which you can actually provide the kind of flexibility which Dr. Dasgupta was talking about? You know, have a system or creative ways in which you can accommodate different concerns. Be in a situation where you are in a state of managed discomfort rather than, you know, achieving comfort, because when the result of a negotiation of countries with different positions takes place, comfort for anyone will not be the point of conclusion. Similarly, initiatives covered by joint statement, I'll not go into detail there. New issues that will keep emerging. And another thought is, why should ministerial meetings be seen as the event where final results have to come? Can we not have something which is more what was envisaged when WTO was established, that you get these results as a matter of normal work processes, whatever the member countries need. So this is the background. You can choose any other. So the questions are, what in your view are the main or priority challenges? And what are the opportunities which you see can be achieved, especially in the near term, which would be, say, 1 year or 2 years? Ambassador, you have the floor. You're
on mute.
You're on mute.
Okay, sorry. Let me start by thanking you for the invite, and also really, I know that we're among friends, so I'm looking forward to a very good conversation. In terms of the questions that you have asked, I'll cover a number of topics. I'll start by firstly identifying the key challenges from my vantage point. One, I think we are witnessing a shift away from multilateralism and consensus decision-making in the WTO towards bilaterals and plurilaterals that are likely to fragment the multilateral trading system. And Ambassador Dasgupta also made reference to the preamble of the Marrakesh Agreement. And in our view, it is clear that the aim of the WTO was to create an integrated, more viable multilateral trading system among its members, including the establishment of principles of multilateralism, non-discrimination, decision-making by consensus, as well as recognition of the differences in levels of development among WTO members and the need for the development acquis. The anxiety that we see from the WTO is the fact that the system has been unable to address existing imbalances, especially those that relate to promoting development and inclusivity, so that you can have equitable benefits from the multilateral trading system. So the system has not sufficiently promoted the effective integration of developing countries in international trade, and in some ways has continued to result in the marginalization of developing countries, and especially African countries who continue to really contribute minutely to global trade. What is also of concern is that it seems the system increasingly protects the interests of multinational companies at the expense of the global good. We have seen this in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, because the system is yet to deliver a credible multilateral response more than 2 years since the start of the pandemic and 18 months since South Africa and India submitted a TRIPS waiver proposal. You've also asked us to reflect on how do we address the issues of polarized discussions within the WTO and to get to a situation of managed discomfort. From our side, we have been really, as the co-sponsors of the TRIPS waiver proposal, been really flexible. We made a proposal in 2020. We revised it in May 2021. We have been engaging, even coming up with a limited scope TRIPS waiver with a view to really try and move towards consensus. And we have also said we need to move beyond the binary between the TRIPS waiver proposal as well as the EU proposal on compulsory licenses. Of course, with India, we are now participating in a process where the DG is facilitating a small group discussion between South Africa, India, US and EU, and we are engaging constructively there to find a solution. So we do acknowledge that in some of these issues, yes, we may not get an outcome that we're looking for, but of course, what is important is to ensure that the outcome ultimately meets its own objectives and purpose, which is really about addressing vaccine inequity, but also diversification of productive capacity across the world, especially in regions that currently import majority of the vaccines, therapeutics and diagnostics. And you'd be aware that Africa is currently importing 99% of its vaccine needs. And of course, we've seen in the context of the pandemic that is an issue that is unsustainable because we still are at the back of the queue with 80% of Africans still yet to receive the first dose. So all of those issues are really important for us if we have to find a system that works for the interests of all. Of course, there have been benefits from the system because I think all of us do recognize that it does contribute to promoting predictability in trade rules. However, we also recognize that trade is not an end in itself. It must be a means to achieve, as the Marrakesh Agreement states, sustainable development. It must enhance the standards of living and promote full employment. And these are the ideals that we believe the system should increasingly strive to achieve. We also see a worrying trend where the WTO is increasingly failing to deliver on agreed mandates, especially those mandates that are of interest to developing countries. And you've spoken about, for example, agriculture. More than 20 years since we agreed on agricultural reform, we still see imbalances and asymmetries in the agreement on agriculture, where the current agreement allows developed countries to provide massive agricultural subsidies that affect the competitiveness of the agricultural sector in developing countries. Not only competitiveness in the export market, but now increasingly affecting the competitiveness of our products in our domestic markets, because our farmers are just struggling to compete against subsidized products that are coming from other members. Therefore, what we see is that after 2 decades of trade talks, we have not concluded the Doha round. Actually, what you see is that some members are now raising questions around the Doha round, including the mandates that are arising from the Doha round, which have been identified by the whole membership as critical to leveling the playing field. We see members, for example, raising questions around the mandates that are associated with special and safeguard mechanism, the public stock holding, special and differential treatment. So all of those issues that are really critical if we are going to have a mutually beneficial multilateral trading system. The Doha issues, except for fisheries negotiations, have made little progress. But even when we look at fisheries subsidies, we are worried about the outcome, because if you look at the outcome, effectively what it tries to do is to lock in the status quo and the benefits for the biggest subsidizers, while the arrangement was supposed to lead to an outcome that effectively disciplines fisheries subsidies and also provide effective and appropriate S&D for developing countries. We see that the disciplines are more and more squeezing the limited policy space that is available to developing countries, while giving massive policy space to the current subsidizers. And we do believe that if we are to really have a successful and sustainable system, we have to respect the mandates, and in this regard, in the case of fisheries subsidies, SDG 14.6 and the whole mandate must be respected. But also importantly, we believe that the fisheries negotiations should provide a unique opportunity for the WTO membership to deliver a fair and equitable outcome. And this can only happen if the principle of common but differentiated responsibility underpins the outcome. President Mandela, in his address to the WTO, emphasized that trade rules should be fair. They must give special consideration to developing countries, and that the WTO should contribute to the changing rather than defending the existing patterns of production. Now, in the interest of time, I'll move quickly to the opportunities. Yeah. I think the WTO has an opportunity to forge a partnership for development. They should start with developing a WTO response to the pandemic that can ensure a more even post-COVID-19 global economic recovery. The approval of the TRIPS waiver is a starting point, so as to diversify global production across the world. And this is essential not only to address the current pandemic, but also future pandemics. And we do believe in a comprehensive WTO response that should also include the trade-related aspects. However, we need to caution here that we need to be careful that the pandemic is not used to exploit the pandemic to further restrict the policy space of developing members to advance a sustainable industrial path. What is also important is to ensure that we move towards a development-oriented multilateral trading system. And of course, this would mean preserving S&D consensus decision-making, which are the core principles of the WTO. And let me just dwell briefly on SND. We have seen in the context of the debates in the WTO on the relevance of SND, sometimes whether we need differentiation. What is important for us is to acknowledge and recognize that we still have the persistence of the development divide between developing and developed countries. And SND remains relevant. And we see that the development divide is also reflected in a wide range of indicators, including the level of development, whether you're talking about the industrial structure, including the receipts from intellectual property rights. And we have tried to address, even in the context of IPR, the need to ensure that there is a balanced outcome, and also to ensure that the IPR system serves the interests of all. And this would be helpful if you can have a WTO that delivers on issues of traditional knowledge systems and benefit sharing. And it's all of those issues where you see that developing countries have an offensive interest and they would want to negotiate. But of course, on those issues of development interest, you find reluctance from the other members to engage. And increasingly, this is what is actually cementing an asymmetrical multilateral trading system. So as I close, I think what will be important to note is that for us, the development mandate remains critical. And even more so in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, and also to promote sustainable economic recovery. I'll quickly touch on reform.
Yeah.
On reform, we do believe that the system must be reformed, because you can see from the intervention and input that I've made that yes, the system is beneficial, but of course the system has constraints that are sometimes through the rules constraining even the development aspirations of developing countries. Therefore, as developing countries, we've been calling since the Uruguay round for the reform of the system. But what is important for us is to ensure that WTO reform should not mean that we accept inherited inequities or new proposals that would worsen the imbalances that we currently see in the system. Therefore, we want a WTO reform discussion to be framed in a balanced manner, and that the agenda should include the issues of interest to all. It should lead to rebalancing of the trade rules so that we can promote structural transformation of our economies. But also importantly, we must then deal finally with the dysfunctionality of the dispute settlement system. And even though you'll see that many African countries are not utilizing the system, it's also because of the issues of accessibility of the system, but also the costs associated with engaging in a dispute within the WTO. So when we talk about the reform of the dispute settlement system, it must not only address the issues of consent to one member, it must address also the issues that African countries have also raised. Yeah. Let me pause there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You've raised a number of very important points. When you come back in the session on comments, one of the thoughts would be to request you to say, what is the way forward so that we can actually conclude in this divisive situation? So now I go to Ambassador Mina. Ambassador Mina, you have the floor. Similar kind of framework of discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Harsha, and great to be hosted this afternoon, this evening by Pune, very reputed centre of study and learning there in India, and I'm delighted to be here with colleagues and friends on this panel. Harsha, we're meeting at a very important moment, and today's has been a very dramatic and grave day in many ways, with the aggression in Europe, the aggression which my own foreign minister has denounced as a violation of some of the norms and principles of international law. And if we needed a reminder of the importance of multilateralism and the importance of the rule of law, I think we have that reminder today. Now, that the issues that are before us here at the WTO also require our support for the rules-based system, our investment in that system, and our confirmation of our dedication to that system. I'll focus my remarks today, Harsha, on 3 areas of challenge, and then I can talk about the opportunities in each of them. The first area of challenge, I think, is relevance. The second is on rulemaking, and the third is on the rule of law. Let me just elaborate a touch. On relevance, we've just heard we've heard Ambassador Dasgupta, we've heard Xolelwa talk eloquently about the need to rise to the challenge of the pandemic. Now, we are one of the countries that thinks it's important to agree swiftly on a TRIPS waiver and to agree a suite of measures that will facilitate trade in medical, pharmaceutical, therapeutic goods in response to the pandemic, the IP elements and the non-IP elements. And it behoves us all to make that quick agreement here at the WTO. Equally, Xolelwa has just done a wonderful job of explaining the challenges associated with agriculture and the enormous subsidization, which now totals over $500 billion US, $500 billion. And you're very familiar with this terrain, Harsha, from your own career. I think Xolelwa spoke eloquently to what that means for many countries, many of us who are unsubsidized and who not only face competitiveness problems, as she said, on the external front, but also in our own home markets. So we've got to deal with those challenges and we've got to demonstrate our relevance. Now, I think the opportunity here is clear. We have a ministerial conference coming. We should be able to agree on measures responding to the pandemic promptly. We should also be able to agree to measures that put the agriculture reform process back on track, in particular in relation to subsidies, but also on issues such as food security, including public stockholding, in a way that works for all. So we do need to restore the relevance of this organisation's response to some of the contemporary challenges that we're facing. But come now to rule making. Now, clearly, we've had a bit of an impasse on rulemaking for many years. Ambassador Dasgupta was talking about the trade facilitation agreement back in 2015, which is a big breakthrough, but we've had very little progress since. So we do need to look at innovative ways of relaunching negotiations. We think it's time to make big strides forward on multilateral rulemaking. In fact, I would go as far as saying, Harsha, that the 12th Ministerial Conference represents something of an inflection point. If we can't drive forward on multilateral rulemaking at this conference on fisheries and agriculture, I think it does put in question our capacity to deliver on the multilateral rulemaking function in future. We've heard talk about smaller configurations such as the joint initiatives, and I like very much the comments that Harsha, you and Ambassador Dasgupta were making about the importance of ensuring such initiatives don't impact on the rights of others, are accompanied by appropriate assistance, do find themselves offering opportunities in a voluntary way to members. And they're all important principles. And that's, I think, the commitment that our country certainly has with respect to a number of these initiatives, including the recently concluded domestic regulation initiative, where it will open up opportunities for non-members of that agreement. So we do need to work in creative ways, remembering that these initiatives are often, and in the case of our country, always a contribution to multilateral rules ultimately. Finally, coming to the rule of law, and again, I've heard you both speak eloquently about this. I don't need to talk in detail, but there is a very grave risk to the wonderful contribution the WTO and its dispute settlement system has made to international stability in the global economy. And that risk is that the impasse on the dispute settlement system continues and the authority of trade law declines. We've got to fix and restore effective dispute settlement at the WTO. We understand there are concerns and challenges that the United States and many others have raised, and we're willing to address those concerns and challenges in a very direct and a very open way. But we need effective dispute settlement restored at the WTO to ensure that it continues to provide the certainty, stability that public international law of trade has provided. So we need to work on that particular element of the institutional infrastructure quite urgently. And the opportunity here again is clear. The opportunity is to start that process immediately. Whether we need to wait for MC12 or we can start earlier, and to bring it to a conclusion soon, so that we can have reform of the dispute settlement system in a manner that meets the needs of all members, and have restoration of effective appellate review here as soon as possible as well. So reform and restoration to get dispute settlement back on track. I might leave my remarks there, Harsha. I know there'll be many issues we can take up in questions later. And thank you again for this opportunity to you and to Pune.
Thank you very much. You have emphasized the kind of principles which Ambassador Dasgupta also talked about, and some of the issues which were spoken about by Ambassador Mlumbi-Peter. I remember in 2006, 2007, there was a small group which came up, the Oslo group, which tried to be a positive contributor to discussion. So it wasn't really aiming to come with certain negotiating positions. Rather, the effort was to clarify the underlying situations. That was much more so, including in agriculture. I wonder if there can be some effort along those lines. So if, when you come back, if one of the points, if you could address is along that way. So now I will request the Ambassador of India, Ambassador Brajendra Navnit, to take the floor and address the same issues. The floor is yours, Ambassador.
Thank you, Harsha, and thank you, Pune International Center and Ministry of External Affairs, for bringing us together on this platform. And thank you for taking out from the CR room. We were supposed to be there in the General Council meeting, which is happening. So George, I can see George is smiling and Xolelwa also smiling. So, and my regards to my illustrious predecessor, Jayant Dasgupta sir, and former Secretary, Anup Wadhawan sir. So I am really privileged to share a panel along with them. So first of all, let me touch upon the challenges. And if I may list out, the first one is that the challenge is that if you forget the preamble of Constitution, or if you forget the preamble of the basic foundation of WTO, which is Marrakech Agreement, then you are entering into a grave challenge. And as Xolelwa mentioned, some of the things appearing in that preamble, we actually have forgotten about full employment. We have actually forgotten about raising a standard of living, and we have actually forgotten about sustainable development. So what we are concentrating here in WTO, my last 1.5 years of experience is, we are only talking about the free trade, and we are not looking at the final objective. We are only looking at the means. So this is the first challenge for me after entering here, that how to remind people of the preamble and take back the dialogue on the track so that we are working towards meeting the objectives. The second challenge for us is how to be more agile and more active in a dynamic world. And here I am referring to when we are facing a pandemic. I know all of us carry some legacy, and we have a lot of veterans here who are working here for last 15, 20, or maybe 25 years. Sometimes I jokingly say that you are from Tokyo around, not even from Uruguay home. So how to leave that legacy and be a little more agile and dynamic to address the problems of present rather than living in the laurels of past, that we did this, we did that. And any multilateral organization, if it is not agile enough to address to the new challenges, then that organization loses its relevance. Like, for example, if IMF will talk about fiscal austerity and fiscal consolidation or monetary tightening during a pandemic, IMF certainly would have lost relevance. But we have seen how these multilateral organizations have changed their views. Sadly, WTO has not done that. So this is the second challenge, that how to have a quick action force in WTO, which are more sensitive towards the present need of the world, rather than trying to correct past mistakes or what has not been achieved in 20-25 years. The third challenge is regarding the legacy, that like we see in constitution, again, I will go back to constitutions, that we have a provision, almost all the democracies of the world or parliamentary system of the world will have a provision to amend the constitution based on the present need without tinkering the basic objective or basic structure. Somehow in WTO, any agreement which is signed, it is signed kind of cast in iron and stone, and then you cannot change it, you cannot revert back to it. We only talk about new agreements and moving forward. We don't talk about how to correct the mistakes of past agreement, the mistakes or designs of such agreements which has not envisaged a situation like a pandemic or a situation like what we are facing, some of our colleagues have referred to about non-market economy. The fourth challenge, what I am seeing in WTO, it's too much of the focus, though we say that negotiation is failing, but too much of focus on the negotiating function and very little focus on monitoring and facilitating functions. So the challenge, and here comes the opportunity also, I will come later on that how can we just stop denouncing WTO and saying that since no new agreement is, because in Parliament also we are not supposed to legislate every day. It has an important function of monitoring and asking questions that whether existing agreements or rules are working fine or they need any change. So this is the fourth challenge which I see that is before us. The fifth challenge is on the fragmentation. Xolelwa talked about. I know George will not be happy with my intervention here because the JSI model or the so-called plurilateral model, because we cannot even call it plurilateral. We know plurilaterals in WTOs are those who are in Annex 4. So these joint statement initiatives are going to actually damage the credential of WTO like anything, because these agreements will not have any backing of a dispute resolution system. Most of these agreements, if they come to rulemaking, it cannot be offered on multilateral basis, which I hear from the participant. And therefore, and it will squeeze on the limited resources of the WTO Secretariat, and it will itself will become unsustainable, because now you will see plethora of JSIs in one name or other being created, and at one point of time, WTO Secretariat will raise hand and say that we cannot handle so many joint statement initiatives. The last challenge, I will say that what I have seen in last 1 year of my working here is of change in roles and responsibility. So what has happened that we are challenging traditional roles here in WTO. And I will give you an example what I hear in my bilateral or some of the other talks, that why India is proposing disciplines. Because here in WTO, developing countries were supposed to not give any proposal for discipline, and developing countries were supposed to only ask for a special and differential treatment and negotiate on a special and differential treatment. So as market is growing, and we know that from where the growth will come in coming 15 to 20 years, we need to cater to that challenge and turn that challenge into an opportunities, that there is nothing wrong in the developing countries seeking disciplines, whether it is in fisheries negotiation, whether it is in TRIPS agreement, or whether it is in agriculture negotiations on domestic subsidy. So these are the challenges. On opportunities, I have like 3 quick points. One is on, as I said, that market is shifting. And if you take India, we may be contributing 3.5% of global GDP. But if you look at the delta in the GDP in coming 10 years or 15 years, even now, today, if you calculate for current year, it is something of the order of 12 to 15% of delta, which is coming from India. And I'm sure if we collate that number for all the developing countries, it will be great in terms of not looking at the base, but looking at the incremental growth from there. And you know, WTO is all about consumption and market capture and market access. So our competitors, they know that they have to dominate us to have market access, but then that gives us an opportunity to negotiate from the points of a strength rather than the traditional role of asking only special and differential treatment. So this is one opportunity which I think a coalition of developing countries can harness and get into at a very strong point. And second one is on opening of that level playing fields. And here I say, when I say level playing fields, I mean the technology and all, because, you know, when we hear rulemaking in e-commerce, let me give you another example that why we are not willing to have rulemaking in e-commerce, because we know that India can take lead in digital authorization and let us say for digital payment. These are two important verticals of e-commerce market. And you know, in India that we don't need dongles for digital signature because we have that unique identification, and we don't need digital, we don't need cards for digital payment because we have UPI. Therefore, any rulemaking which is targeted towards the dongle-based authorization, digital authorizations, or card-based digital payment system is not good. So we have to find opportunities, and we have already created that opportunity to work like an Android-based system where we actually encourage innovations and allow people to come and pile on apps on that Android-based systems. And our Android-based systems are like, I gave you example of unique identity as well as the UPI. So these are the things which I think is, in my opinion, is going to create opportunities for us. And last point, I would say that I hear a lot of this rhetoric that WTO is dead, but whatever people will do, bilateral or plurilateral agreements or regional agreements, you know, today also the 70% of world trade is moving on MFN basis or national treatment basis. So I don't see that any country leaving WTO. Yes, they may like to paralyze it or may like the dispute settlement system to be non-functional, but the existing agreements or role of MFN and national treatment is going to continue for a few years at least. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You have made some very interesting points. And one thing which I would like you to consider when you're commenting later is you talked about domestic reform and domestic initiatives which have created opportunities. So how that can actually create positive synergy with whatever changes might take place within the WTO system. How can that be a lesson both? And you rightly pointed out that WTO doesn't have only the negotiating function. It has fora where you discuss, you exchange experiences. So a number of experiences you talked about can be good examples for others to follow also. But at the same time, negotiation is something which also manages to keep alive or in step with whatever changes are happening in the world around you, including through your domestic reform. So if you could just provide us some thought on that. Now I come to the former Commerce Secretary, Mr. Anup Wadhawan. Same kind of framework. The floor is yours.
Sir, you're on mute.
Thank you so much, Harsha. I'm delighted to be here. My thanks to the organizers, Pune International Center and MEA in particular, and my thanks to the very, very distinguished participants in this discussion for this opportunity to be amidst them. So I think most of the points have been made. Let me just quickly outline, my understanding of this situation from a first principles perspective. and see, what the prognosis is for the future and what are the pathways that can lead to a positive prognosis for the future. Clearly it is undisputed if you look at the theoretical underpinnings that multilateral trade liberalization is the most efficient sort of instrument for trade liberalization. It overcomes many of the distortions and diversions which happen in, say, bilateral or regional agreements or plurilateral agreements. So from an efficiency point of view, it's the most efficient. And of course, from an equity point of view, it is potentially the most equitable. It gives everyone a voice. In particular, it gives a voice to nations which are economically weaker, don't have much bargaining power in a bilateral or regional platform. And to the extent, developing countries draw strength from each other, it provides a platform which can address the equity issue also. And of course, as Ambassador Mina mentioned and others have mentioned, there is significant achievement as far as WTO is concerned in terms of trade under the auspices of WTO having happened in a organized, smooth manner for several decades under a rule-bound system, rule-based system, and with a effective, I think by and large, an effective and fair dispute resolution mechanism accompanying it. And of course, down the road, concerns began to develop. And I think you can trace the key concerns of the developing countries to the fact that the envisaged outcomes did not materialize. That was the first set of concerns which arose, that the outcomes which you envisaged, particularly on the development side, were not, forthcoming. Inequity amongst nations was not decreasing. Trade was being seen as an end in itself, whereas it was only a means for, employment and economic growth and greater economic equity amongst nations. And this, of course, led to all that effort towards, resolving the implementation issues. It led to the Doha agenda being developed. And for some time, there was some seriousness about it, but then, of course, there was no forward movement. There was no traction on Doha. And in some ways, the underlying commitment of the WTO to development, to reduction of inequity, the underlying commitment to certain principles of, special and differential treatment, all those commitments came into question, and the Doha round, of course, collapsed, as we've all seen. And then, of course, from the developed country side, of course, the fact that the Doha agenda collapsed was necessarily required a counter view on the part of the developed world to all these fundamental, objectives that the WTO was set up for. So there was a deep chasm which developed, and it's been compounded by other aspects which have come along on the way. The entire issue of, overreach or alleged overreach of the appellate body, which has brought the appellate body to a standstill. There's an alternative approach which the EU has propounded, the MPIA. That again is not getting much traction at a broader level. It is not getting traction from the main detractors of the appellate body system. And I don't see that, chasm moving towards any convergence. And of course, then on the way, concerns about non-market economies came along, and unfair practices by certain countries, lack of market-based functioning of their economic stakeholders, and of course down the road all these sort of stresses developed, and then we reached a stage where we saw a lot of unilateralism happening. So it was not just, lack of forward movement on the negotiating agenda, on the Doha agenda. It was not, simply lack of forward movement there, but unilateralism which questioned the existing agreements, in a sense, invoking security concerns to go beyond your bound rates. The US imposed those duties. A lot of unilateral actions which took another step back. It is not just that the negotiating agenda was not going forward, but the existing agreements were in question. And of course, there was no dispute resolution. So in a sense, there were rules, but there were no rules. You were free to violate them. You exceed your bound rates on some specious, security grounds. Some matter goes into dispute. The appeal never gets resolved. So we went, even further behind. It was not just a question of no forward movement. We're actually moving backwards. And now, of course, the way forward is being linked to the whole issue of reform. And reform, again, the understanding of nations as to what reform means, what reform should be, is very varied. Some countries are basically questioning all the core principles on which the WTO was founded, special and differential treatment, the consensus principle. So all those, core issues are being questioned now in the name of reform. Whether we can find a balanced way forward in reform, hard to say. And of course, Doha issues getting abandoned, serious concerns about, for instance, public stock holding, serious concerns about inequities of the agreement on agriculture, all those left to the wayside. There were agreed ministerial mandates, and now we have new issues coming up, whether it is e-commerce or investment facilitation. And now I believe there's a new plurilateral on, trade and environment sustainability. And and then of course, along with them came, plurilateralism, which again threatens to undermine, the multilateral principle of the WTO. So clearly there's a deep, chasm. There was some hope in some areas. For instance, fisheries, there was some hope, some convergent, negotiation would happen. But then, as our colleague, the ambassador from South Africa, mentioned, there's an effort to convert the fisheries agreement into a new agreement on agriculture, where, the inherited sort of endowments of certain countries get preserved and others get, curtailed in terms of their policy options. And then you don't have any rectification of the situation that exploitation of fishery resources today is highly inequitable across the world. The fact that this agreement should deal with that is left on the wayside, and some agreement on the lines which is being negotiated, if it is agreed to, what it will do is just status quo. The existing inequities in exploiting fisheries resources and exploiting them inequitably, those will just get preserved. The TRIPS waiver was another great opportunity for the world to come together. And of course, we missed that bus. And now there is some indication of, the epidemic becoming an endemic issue. And of course, the fact remains that large parts of the world are not vaccinated. So in many ways, we are way behind, and it was an opportunity where the world could have come to an agreement. The stakes were not that high. It was a one-time deviation in a very specific circumstance. It was not something which would be in perpetuity. It was not going to be something which was going to be in perpetuity across the canvas. It was a very specific intervention where the world could have shown the resolve. The waiver approach versus the compulsory license approach, I'm sure, better sense could have prevailed and a way forward could have been found which addressed everyone's concerns. So clearly, there's a deep fundamental chasm amongst the membership. And I agree with Ambassador Mina that we are at an inflection point, and very soon it might become a point of no return. And, at one level, I feel maybe no one is really worried about it. At some level, it's becoming WTO is becoming a talking shop. business goes on as usual. Countries are trading, they are working on their economies, they are negotiating their trade agreements bilaterally, regionally, and a lot of regional agreements have come to the fore. Large part of the world is now coming under the canvas of these bilateral and regional agreements. So maybe that point of inflection which has been reached, we'll just go past it post MC12, and it will become a pure talking shop with no signs of convergence. I feel very pessimistic as to whether, in this deep chasm across the board, you look at all these issues, there's a deep chasm, and I'm concerned whether a sort of convergence can be reached. But nevertheless, let me suggest, my approach to a logical way forward. Clearly you need balance. You need balance in, number one, the negotiation agenda, and number two, you need balance on the reforms. Now, the negotiation agenda, clearly, given the divide, it cannot be purely an inherited agenda of the past, but key elements of that past agreed mandate have to be carried forward. The agreement on agriculture related negotiations must happen. Agricultural subsidies, must be made more equitable. And of course, concerns like public stockholding, especially, given the economic stresses, the world will increasingly be exposed to economic stresses from climate change. We just saw COVID as a huge economic stress. I think public stockholding becomes a very important agenda which needs to be, taken forward. And of course, fisheries, based on a balanced approach, which reaches that outcome we are trying to seek. What is the outcome we are trying to seek? That fisheries resources must not be overexploited. Fisheries resources must be shared by the world in an equitable manner. So can we reach that or not? Or are we going to do another agreement on agriculture where all the inequities stay and, world production is totally remotely, totally divorced from comparative advantage? If you look at agricultural production, it is totally divorced from the comparative advantage nations have in agriculture based on huge subsidies, by certain countries. So, and of course, some new issue, maybe the, investment facilitation agreement can be the new TFA. I'm not sure whether that would be possible or people would be agreeable to that. So maybe an agenda with some key inherited issues and some of these new issues to go forward. And then, of course, the second is the reform agenda. The reform agenda must happen parallelly, otherwise, we'll not resolve the dispute resolution issue, we'll not resolve other major issues. So here again, we could think in terms of preserving the core principles of the WTO and addressing, specific concerns that need to be addressed while preserving core issues. For instance, developing country status. In my individual capacity, I think it's a prudent thing to do. Countries which are at huge, high levels of per capita income should not invoke developing country status. Clearly, some rules need to be brought in. A special and differential treatment, clearly, it needs to be there, but maybe we can have some provisions to ensure that it does not create a permanent distortion. It does not create a permanent unequal, playing field. And at the same time, we take steps to ensure that the development divide and the lack of economic equity is addressed. So I think if we really get together and carve out a core agenda, both on the negotiation side and on the reform side, which takes things forward, addressing specific issues that I mentioned, without, disrupting the core principles of consensus, special and differential treatment, and a two-stage appellate body system, then I think some way forward can be found. But let me just repeat at the risk of annoying everyone, that I find myself in a very, very pessimistic position regarding the possibility of convergence. And the basic reason is that it is not really hurting anyone. No one is really getting hurt. No one is feeling any pain. People are willing to endlessly stick to their positions and endlessly go on in a non-convergent manner. But I hope I'm proved wrong. So I'll conclude with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. We have about 20 minutes left in the session. So we will have your comments, maybe about 3 minutes each, 4 minutes each. There are 5 of you. Now, I begin with requesting Ambassador Dasgupta, some comments on what you've heard and the way forward. I mean, is it really that nothing can be done, or are there some ways forward which actually could move the system towards some collaborative effort? Ambassador Dasgupta.
Thank you, Harsha. It was a very interesting exposure for me in hearing different perspectives, but there was a common strand running through many of them. I quite agree with Ambassador Mina that this is a point of inflection, and also with Mr. Anup Wadhawan that we have this very real threat that the WTO is going to become irrelevant because nobody is really getting hurt. People who can influence the process, who can bring about new negotiations or new solutions are not really getting hurt. So they are not interested. So I share that pessimism to a great extent. Now, the first thing which I wanted to mention is a few facts have emerged as common action points, let us say. On the reforms agenda, I think the topmost is the DSU reforms, because getting into new agreements will not have the same salience if there is not going to be a working dispute settlement system. So the first step in this direction is to, and I must say it out very openly, is to bring the Americans back to the negotiating table, because they seem to have distanced themselves from going on at the WTO, and especially the dispute settlement system. They have not mentioned whether they like certain aspects of the EU proposal or they reject the entire thing. So the first thing which is required is to bring the Americans back to the negotiating table and ask them, because though it would seem iniquitous that one country would be given this kind of importance, but without the Americans, the WTO will not be able to function. Without the Europeans, for instance, or the Chinese for that matter, it will not be able to function. So we need to do that on an as soon as possible.
2 more minutes. Yeah.
The second point I wanted to mention is that the proposal by Mr. Wadhawan about a mix of the old issues, the legacy issues, and the new issues could be the way forward. So let us then pick up issues like the agricultural reforms and fisheries subsidies, but from a new perspective. Fisheries subsidies, the way it has been framed, will only perpetuate the large fishing fleets which have the more advanced countries have built up, etc., and squeeze the policy space of the developing countries. So I think it will have to be rewritten. The last point I wanted to mention is that what is missing is this great element of trust. We do not know what is the underlying motive behind the tabling of a new proposal by any country, especially the countries which have been tabling the most proposals, let's say in the past 20, 30 years. So that needs to be, I think there has to be trust, and that trust has to be developed once again if it has broken down for any negotiations to proceed. I'll finish.
Thank you. So Ambassador Mlumbi-Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'll pick up from where Ambassador Dasgupta has left off. I do fully agree with you that I think one of the fundamental issues that is leading the WTO to be at the inflection point is the lack of trust and political will. Probably what we need to do as a way forward would be to find a neutral platform where different perspectives can be shared without necessarily negotiating, but at least to understand and appreciate each other's interests and also each other's positions, because I get a sense that we are not even listening to each other. Even before South Africa speaks, someone is ready to react, and the reaction is to reject whatever South Africa puts forward. And that is what has been lacking in the discussion, that we are not really engaging in good faith, solution-oriented discussions that will lead to real compromises. The second issue that I think will be critical as a way forward, I think we need to have a system that works for all. And of course, any system that keeps coming up with mandates, but anyone can ignore the mandate and we can move on to a new issue, is also actually contributing to the lack of trust, because the others, especially developing countries, feel increasingly that their issues of interest are put into the periphery, and then the issues of interest to developed countries are the ones that are able to move forward. Thirdly, the issue of relevance that George and Brajendra spoke to, I think is also critical. You can't have a system that fails to deliver for the majority of its membership. Any system that does that and does not lead to equitable outcomes is likely to lose relevance. And of course, if we can't even deliver in the case of a pandemic where all of us have been affected, of course, in different measure, but ultimately, this has been one thing that I was hoping would unite the WTO so that we find an outcome. And if we fail on this one, I don't see how we can deliver on issues that are related to climate change. And lastly, I think I'll pick up on the point that Brajendra raised about the importance of coalition building. Both among developing countries, but also coalition building between developed as well as developing countries. And from a developing country perspective, we really need to find a way of crystallizing our offensive interests and driving in unison to achieve those. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very, very important points and some pointers to future action platform as well as emphasis. So Ambassador George Mina, the floor is yours now with your comments.
Well, Harsha, this has been a very rich discussion. I've enjoyed it very much. A couple of observations from me. First, Brajendra, Xolelwa, former Commerce Secretary Wadhawan have all said something in a slightly different way, which I agree entirely with, and that is that the WTO is the bedrock of the global trading system. It must remain the bedrock, and we need to reinforce it. There's no choice but to reinforce it. I'll come back to that at the end. So while there are massive risks, while there is an inflection point coming this year, I'm not a pessimist. I think we can and must respond to these risks. I think we can and must. Second, a number of us have talked about the restoration of the dispute settlement system. That's a must. It's been in abeyance for effectively 2 years. The authority of global trade law, which is leading to all of the transgressions that former Commerce Secretary Wadhawan has just outlined, will continue if we don't have the effective rule of law on trade. That means dispute settlement reform is urgent. Third, rulemaking must be allowed to progress. I mean, I'm very happy with the idea that former Commerce Secretary Wadhawan has just put forward about a mix of the old and the new. By the way, agriculture is not just old, it's also the future of sustainability. It's also the future of food security. So it's also new. But we do need to think about other areas of rulemaking. And there, I mean, just to reassure my colleague, Brajendra, I mean, he's raised a number of the well-known criticisms of the joint initiatives. I want to reassure him on his point that they're not multilateral in character. Of course, they will be contributions to multilateral initiatives over time. I want to reassure him that they will have the backing of dispute settlement provisions. I want to assure him that they are going to be member-driven and multi-track unnecessarily from resources in the organisation. So, and I, of course, want to reassure him that India should be part of e-commerce, given its leading role in the issue globally. And don't worry, Brajendra, there are tech-neutral solutions in every one of those provisions you mentioned. But finally, just a point of what to next. I think we do have a moment of solidarity here. People are starting to recognise the threats to this system. We do have an urgent need to unite. I think the idea you had, Harsha, of some kind of Oslo group style process, it's a bit similar to what we just heard Xolelwa say. That is an open, inclusive dialogue on WTO reform that actually has us listening to one another and has us rebuilding the consensus behind this organisation's mission and purpose. That's what's required now, and that I think I've heard today a lot of commitment towards that goal. Thanks, Harsha.
Thank you very much. So next is Ambassador Brajendra Navnit. The floor is yours, Ambassador.
Thank you, Harsha. So first, let me touch upon what you have given me, the question on the domestic reform and the positive synergy. I can give you one example. If and this is again my personal opinion, not the country view, that if I would have been, let us say, in the Uruguay round and negotiating special and differential treatment, I would have taken a route of a structural adjustment loan kind of thing, which World Bank used to offer. Now I don't know in what name they are delivering it. There used to have a performance matrix associated with those shock loans from IDA. And a lot of countries have come out with very credible and significant reforms on factors of production because of those initiatives. So I see domestic reforms and SNDT in that positive synergy, that it gives an opportunity to the economy to graduate and take up reforms on its own, while 20-25 years, they get that transition time to compete with the world. Now, a couple of things which I think is way forward. So I will be again slightly different from the narrative here. What I see that we may continue discussing on negotiating function and all, but the opportunities I see. One is on trade finance. We have a mechanism here in WTO. It is dead. I think it is high time to revive that trade finance thing and how to interact with other international organizations in this field. So that is my one take, that where WTO should look forward. The second one is the better use of trade policy review. And there we can, I think, benefit or learn from Article 4 consultations of International Monetary Fund, where they do it for respective countries, because again, our trade policy review is much of symbolic in nature, 4 or 5 years after, and then it is more of question answer. And some of the question answers are just for the sake of asking questions, because I remember we answered in our last trade policy review 1,500 questions. So it can be reformed and to be made more on Article 4 consultation side. And the last one, I see that the present agreements have not been designed for non-market economy and dumping in that sense, where the non-formal economy is contributing a larger proportion to a big size economy, not a small size economy. And you have certain goods which are being exported, which are consumed in very less proportion of overall production in the exporting country. So these are the things I think we can bring in the concept of equity market, of what you call a stop loss or circuit breakers, both on positive side and negative side, so that you have a balance and you don't have the ghost industrialized town where all employments have been wiped out because of relocation in the name of trade liberalization and competitive environment.
Very thoughtful and useful. I think some of your ideas need to be taken up within the system. Some might be taken up in the kind of discussion which Ambassador Mlumbi-Peter talked about, where you are discussing options and ways forward. And some of them actually need to recall the fact that all exercises which are being performed using data and reviews should be helping the countries concerned to improve their own situation. And in that context, I wonder if there can be some initiative on, and need not be WTO Secretariat initiative, but something where the kind of database you need for your own reform in terms of success cases, in terms of, how people have addressed concerns, etc., could be built up in to create centers of excellence. They could be regional, they could be at a global level. So very, very good ideas. And I compliment all of you for that. Now I will go to former Commerce Secretary Anup Wadhawan for his comments.
Thank you.
Floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I don't have much to add. All I would like to say is that, the world needs to find the mutual trust and the collective will to, number one, realize the importance of the WTO, as we've all stressed, realize the gains which the world at large can obtain from, taking the WTO system forward constructively. Overcoming the technical issues is not the major challenge. Once you find the collective will and that mutual trust, all these, technical hitches which we see as insurmountable today can be surmounted. But the issue is whether that, collective wisdom will prevail or not. I've expressed some pessimism about that, but then I'm happy to be proven wrong. And pessimism comes from the fact that, no one is being driven in that direction by their own self-interest. They're not being driven there because they're not really getting hurt in this current, confusion. So I'm pessimistic on that account, but let's hope, some convergence does materialize. And what, Harsha, what you said just now, it's important that developing countries in particular don't get detracted from the need to put their own house in order. A lot of developing countries have made huge progress. China is one example. Maybe it's a somewhat controversial example to give, but we need to put our own house in order, overcome the weaknesses of our economies, overcome the major structural problems in our economies, and that will also help in our, sensitivities evolving. And at some level, we have to graduate out of our sensitivities of poverty, sensitivity of the huge agricultural economy on which a large number of people are dependent. So those sensitivities also you'll overcome only through economic development. And countries have shown that that process can in some ways be divorced from whether WTO takes off or not. So I think that is the imperative before policy makers, especially in developing countries. Put your house in order. No one is stopping you from doing the right thing in your economies. And I hope that happens at a parallel level. Maybe developing countries can come together on that platform. How do we collectively develop our economies? So that can be a way forward. So thank you so much. It's been wonderful.
Thank you. I think very substantive points have been made. Obviously, there are lots of difficulties and fragmentation, but ideas from each of you and some very new ideas, including what could create solutions, the momentum for solution. So I thank you, each of you, for this very positive interaction, and I wish you luck in your work in Geneva. And I hope that with that effort, the pessimism which was expressed becomes something which we were worried about, but do not experience. So I thank you all. There are no questions from the audience. So that brings us to the end of this session. Really a privilege. I thought it's very, very nice. And one can now think of how to take some of these ideas forward, and perhaps we can devise something which we share with you for, but each of you has come up with some very good ideas. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much indeed for such an insightful discussion and for guiding us towards the future of cooperative and collaborative global trade and commerce. Day 2 of the Asia Economic Dialogue 2022 now comes to an end. I'm sure all our viewers have enjoyed the stimulating conversations and hope to see you all in many, many more back here tomorrow. We start at 10:30 in the morning, India time. For now, good evening, good night, Shubhratri.
Bye-bye.